principles that these groups of adults wanted to pass on to their sons and daughters.
Yes.
And so it became, I mean, there were just many of these groups. You know, Daniel Boone Society, the woodcraft folk, they were all about outdoor living and skills. As the Western migration had, you know, filled out, we were to the border in the Pacific. We were in California.
Our manifest destiny.
Our manifest destiny that was fulfilled, and now we were getting wimpy too, and so we also had to go out to the woods and build fires with no matches and camp out and learn to recover some of, in this country, what was also associated with the values of Native American people. You know, a kind of an ability to live in nature, perceived. That was one of the perceptions. And so this all leads us up to a period in the early 20th century, about from 1902 to 1920, when we really created, or when were created, the big national youth organizations that are still present on the scene today.
So you've touched a bit on some of our national youth work organizations. I'd like to learn a little more about how they really influence this youth work organization and its movement.
They're very important because, number one, they kind of, some of them link us to the history in England, but mostly they're important because once they appeared on the American scene, they have been with us now 100 years. Many of them are celebrating their 100th anniversary in sometime between 202 and 220. In 1902, 19 to 20, we had the formation here of the Boy Scouts, and Juliet Lowe went to England, spent some time with the Girl Guides and with Baden-Powell, and brought back to Savannah, Georgia, the Girl Scouts. Yes. Campfire Girls, now Campfire Boys and Girls, but Campfire Girls was formed by Charlotte and Luther Gulick up in Sebago, Maine at a camp, and it was really a very indigenous, you know, youth organization. Junior Achievement, Junior Red Cross, boys clubs, now Boys and Girls Clubs, and the YMCA Reserves and YMCA Pioneers and YWCA Reserves. You know, these organizations all came in that about 20-year, 18-year period. They were very much about the personal development, again, this how to be a grown-up, how to grow and live with character, with honor, with confidence as a patriotic person, they almost all had camping programs. And 4-H was one of these as well in this kind of initial group. 4-H is interesting to me. I looked particularly at that organization. And, you know, at a time when Theodore Roosevelt was president and we had this interest and concern about rural life, he started a commission on the rural life. He was concerned about both the fact that there were isolated communities and that they also didn't have many of the things large cities were having, these museums, the libraries, the art, the kinds of things that we mentioned. The Cooperative Extension Service was present in every county across the country. And Dewey and Jane Addams and other educators were really intrigued with the progressive education. And then all these youth organizations were beginning to bubble up. And it was just a natural thing that in a rural area, you would begin to have this 4-H organization. It again premised on the idea that young people would lead. If we gave good information to young people, they would bring it into their families. So, you know, hybrid seed corn came from the universities through young people, you know, into the practice of rural America and into farming. So, you know, each one of these developed a kind of portfolio of programs. They were usually gender separated. 4-H was not, but mostly it was about how you be a man or how you be a woman. And because printing and communications had grown so much, one of the things that started to happen was there were books written for the young people in these organizations. That's what happens to be the Red Cross girls at work. But there were, you know, you can find these in old used bookstores kind of all over the place. This was given to someone in 1913. But it was to not only instill the values of the story, friendship, loyalty, making good judgments, critical thinking, good decision making, but it was also about literacy, so that young people were inspired, they belonged to the group, so they read the stories of the group, and that's how they kind of got the history. These movements dominated probably for 50 years, up through the 1950s. Sports leagues were also coming to play at that time. You know, clubs that formed around judo and hockey and tennis and soccer, well, probably not soccer as much, but, you know, baseball, Little League formed in these years. And so up through the 1950s, this attention was very much on now, not the movement so much as growing good kids, growing good citizens, and fun and learning were all built into that. We come to the 1960s and the 1970s, particularly the 60s, and this kind of, you get again a change in climate with the Vietnam War. So groups began to form around social justice issues, around voter registration in the civil rights time, around mothers against drunken driving, students against drunken driving, you know, kind of prevention sort of things as Al-Anon, that's right, exactly. And the 60s, the end of the 60s to the 70s got to be sort of an anti-establishment time. That wasn't the easiest time for the big national youth orgs, because they weren't founded on a notion of civil rights as their cause, or you know, social justice issues, the anti-war, the peace movement. So we really had two streams during that period of time. And I think when we emerged out of the 60s and 70s, we found ourselves in a time where science was now, had very much inserted itself into the social science literature. We were beginning to pathologize young people. Now we became worried about how many babies they had at what age and whether they were married, how soon they took their first drink, when they had their first sexual experience. I mean, it was count them, categorize them, label them at risk.
So a very negative perception of how young people are operating.
Well, we think so. I mean, we resist that kind of labeling now. But at the time, it was really trying to understand the behavior and what was going on. But it resulted in a lot of prevention programs, a lot of labeling of young people. You had to be at risk to participate in this or that group. And again, the large formal national youth organizations who were pretty pledged to serve everyone, but had ended up serving sometimes a narrower audience, struggled to figure out how what role they played in this at-risk kind of medical model environment. We begin to see a reaction against that fix-it medical model saying, look, we need to build on young people's strengths, we need to return. Now, this is really when we begin to say organizations are formed to address adolescents' needs and their interests. Not that this hasn't been happening all along, but less intentionally. And now, after something like the Search Institute's 40 Assets, we find people saying, we're forming this activity, this program, to build on young people's strengths, to help them be all they can be, not to have them be art instrument, not to have them fixed, not to have them improved, but rather to help them go where they want to go in the course of their life in positive ways.
That's an enormous shift from the language people were using, simply talking about young people, and just what you're saying in those few comments.
It is, and I think, you know, kind of having both of us been a part of that language shift, one wondered sometimes why it was so difficult. But when you're mindful of this long history, and a fact that most of the organizations weren't prepared to take a strong stand different than what had evolved over time, you see that it was really quite an endeavor. And now I think this notion of youth development is really, very firmly embedded